Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia. This is Hall Monitor, the program where we discuss local government, consumer affairs, local politics, and much, much more. My name is Larry McGlynn, and I am joined by co hosts Denise Clay Murray. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And Lance Haver. Lance, how are you doing?
I'm fine. I was enjoying the snow as your son was. I didn't
He
quite get
did.
I didn't get anyone to put me on their sled, but I did enjoy it anyway.
Owen enjoyed the
Aw.
sled. Well, I wouldn't say he enjoyed it. He just had a very straight face the entire time, like he could take it or leave it. So I don't know what
Yes,
that
he
means.
he, he kind of did look unimpressed.
Yeah. But
Next
that
year.
that's okay. But hopefully no more significant snowstorms. Although we are watching something apparently for the weekend now. I just
Hmm.
heard. But before we get to that, we have a big show tonight for you. Tonight we are going to have an interview Denise did earlier today with Kadita Kenner, who is the leader of the New Pennsylvania Project, and we're going to have a very interesting discussion with her. Lance is going to talk to us about the state stores. And after, at the end of the show, we're going to talk about the report that City Council just issued with the assistance of the District Attorney's Office and the Police Department about shootings in Philadelphia. But before we get to that, we're going to lead off with Denise's interview with Kitty Kenner. Denise, what do we need to know about this?
Well, we talked a lot about redistricting, and we also talked about the Commonwealth Court's decision to say that you needed a constitutional amendment to begin um, mail-in balloting. So we talked about how redistricting maps are formed and different things. It was a really interesting discussion, and she also talked about what she's doing with the New Pennsylvania project, how this all figures into it, and why it's important.
Oh, that sounds great. So let's see our interview with Kadita Kenner.
Good evening, and this is Hall Monitor. I'm Denise Clay Murray, and I'm here with Kadita Kenner, the executive director of the New Pennsylvania Project, a group of people that are going around the state making sure that if you are not a voter, that you become one just in time for the 2022 midterms and the governor's election and some other things that are coming up. But I wanted to have her on to talk about redistricting and some of the other things that are going on that are related to your right to vote. So thank you for joining us, Kadita. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Denise.
So let's start first with redistricting. There's a lot that goes into that people don't necessarily understand. We know that it's something that's done every 10 years because of the census, but what is the process of redistricting, and why is it that Pennsylvania seems to be, you know, not necessarily doing it smoothly right now?
A lot of folks call Pennsylvania a battleground state, and it is, but it also is a very gerrymandered state. And so, as you mentioned, every 10 years after we complete the census, if we're actually doing that, right? So that's important to note. We do reapportionment of the districts so that the people of the Commonwealth can actually elect legislators versus legislators selecting who it is they're going to represent. And so that's the key point here when it comes to redistricting, the reapportionment, and the process. So in the past, the process has been that legislators create the maps, which helps you if you're someone who's a legislator currently and you're hoping to protect your incumbency because you want to get reelected, that you draw a map that is favorable to you so that you have a better shot at being reelected versus what the changes in the demographics are. Population decline here in the Commonwealth tells us that we're going to lose a US congressperson because of the population shift, but the population shift also in Pennsylvania tells us that there are more communities of color, more folks of color, and they need to be represented fairly, and we need to have a representative democracy. And so there are various ways in which we're currently conducting reapportionment and redistricting. So we're creating maps in this moment for the state legislature. So for our state representatives, our state senators, that's one map that's being created. And that was being done with the LRC, the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. And they're going to determine what maps it is that Pennsylvanians will get to vote on districts come the May primary. Hopefully, we're going to have a May primary on May 17th. If that doesn't change because we're still waiting for maps to be approved. Then there's also the congressional maps, and those are the maps that let us know that we're going from having 18 U.S. representatives representing us in D.C. and going down to 17, and those maps need to get redrawn and be fair. And in the past, they've been drawn by legislators who, again, protect their incumbency. And so we want to make sure that the maps going forward for 2022 and 2032 and 42 are all fair and representative of the demographics of the Commonwealth, and not for the benefit of legislators who draw maps to secure that they can be reelected.
Now, how do the people make sure that this is the process that takes place and make sure that it's fair? What can they do to make sure that it's fair?
We have to, voting is one thing we can do, and that's just not enough in these times. We have to have, we need to be involved in what is happening in our democracy. We need to be involved. And so what people can do is they can reach out to their legislators and they can let them know that, we're calling for fair maps. We want to be represented by people who are representative of us and not the other way around. They can also, there was an opportunity, it's too late now, but people were creating their own maps, using software and apps and mathematics and coming up with their own people's maps that they believed were more consistent with the demographic shift here in the Commonwealth. So that period is expired right now where you could submit a map of your own, if you're someone who's into that. I mean, they have programs where they have like elementary school students creating maps, and they sometimes do a better job than the legislators have done. So that's one way in which people can get involved. Get involved in the map making process. Again, it's too late for this time around, but know that for the future that you have an opportunity to do that and be heard by the legislative reapportionment commissions and others when they hold community conversations, when they hold hearings. I'm actually someone who testified in the Legislative Reapportionment Commission hearing a couple of weeks ago in Harrisburg, where I wanted to call attention to the fact that we need fair representation. If me being a Black woman wearing my hair natural, I would like to have a representative who understands that issue, that if I'm being discriminated against in the workplace because of the way I wear my hair naturally, I need a representative who understands that that is a concern of mine and will bring legislation forward, because that representative, that legislator represents me. They need to understand all the needs of their constituents. If we have folks whose first, primary language is Spanish, we need to make sure that representatives representing us in government have folks in their offices who can speak to their constituents, all of their constituents, those who voted for them and those who did not, and those who are not even of voting age who need representation. So I think that's really important for everybody out there to hear.
I was listening to the city council redistricting hearings this morning, and one of the issues that kept coming up was prison gerrymandering, legislative redistricting that allows a municipality that has a prison to take the people in that prison and count them toward their legislative district instead of the legislative districts they come from. Is that one of the issues that needs to be worked out with this particular set of maps? Is that still going on, or has Pennsylvania done something to try to, I guess, keep it at bay?
There's been legislation along the way. Leader Joanna McClinton authored a prison gerrymandering bill, which got bipartisan support. I think it's important to note that, yes, there is a such thing called prison gerrymandering. And what happens is it robs communities, particularly communities of color, of their power. When we are taking folks who come from Philadelphia and we are placing them, incarcerating them in, let's say, Forest County. Anybody ever been to Forest County, Pennsylvania, right? We're placing them in Forest County, Pennsylvania. We are then giving their political power to Forest County. And so that changes the numbers there in the county, where Forest County wouldn't have such a population. They're now having a population because they're including the incarcerated folks who are now being imprisoned in those prisons there, or those jails in Forest County. And so what happens is the folks who are incarcerated have less political power because they're no longer being represented back in Philadelphia by someone who had been representing them prior to incarceration or their family members who live there. They are now being counted in Forest County, which gives the funding to Forest County. It helps them pave their roads and, pave their roads and bridges and repair their bridges. It helps them with funding for various things. It could be for COVID mitigation. So all that funding goes to a place in which someone actually doesn't even have voting power. But for the majority of this, it gives power to white folks and takes it away from communities of color who are over incarcerated in this moment.
So how does all of this impact what you do with the New Pennsylvania Project? For people who don't know what the New Pennsylvania Project is, and I don't know how many of our listeners may not know that, but I'm just going to assume that there might be some. Talk a little bit about the New Pennsylvania Project and how all of this stuff with redistricting affects what you do.
Yeah. There are 1.1 million Pennsylvanians who are eligible to vote in this moment, but not registered to vote. And they've chosen to remain out of the electorate. They've chosen not to cast a ballot at all. Maybe they're 49 years old and have never cast a ballot. They just don't think that politics is for them. They don't think that their needs are being met. They don't think that any political party is going to make a change in their life. And so they've stayed out of the electorate. There are some who voted maybe for the first time ever in 2008 and haven't voted since. For the same reasons I just said, those aren't joining at all because they don't see their needs being met. They don't see their lives changing. So what it is that we're trying to do as the New Pennsylvania Project is bring all those folks into the electorate so we can build power in these neighborhoods who are not seeing change. And that's how you bring about the change. We need to make sure that elected officials feel us, feel our power, and understand that we will get to the ballot box every May and every November. We vote twice a year here in the Commonwealth. And it's not just these presidential elections that are so sexy that everybody wants to come out and vote for, but it's these these smaller elections or these municipal elections, these local elections that folks need to come out for in record numbers, because this is how things get done. And this is where change happens on the local level. All voting is local, right? So I think that it's important for people to hear that the New Pennsylvania Project is all about bringing folks back into the electorate or into the electorate for the first time, particularly amongst communities of color. There are 20% of all Black folks who are eligible to vote are not registered. 31% of all Latinx folks who are eligible to vote are not registered. 42% of all Asian Pacific Islander folks who are eligible to vote are not registered in the Commonwealth. And the youth vote as well. Only 1 in 4 high school Pennsylvanians who are eligible to vote are registered to vote, 1 in 4. And that number goes down even less in the cities, in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. It's something like 15% at this moment. 15% of all eligible high school students are registered to vote. And we can't wait for them to get on college campus to register them to vote because not everybody attends college. And so we need to make sure that we're getting to the young folks right now in this moment as well, or we're going to lose a generation of voters. So what we do at the New Pennsylvania Project is we knock on doors. We meet people where they are, if it's their home, if it's the bodega, if it is their neighborhood barber. We're trying to meet them where they are, talk to them about the issues, listen to them about what the issues are that are keeping them from joining the electorate, and then getting them by multiple touches. Sometimes we have to talk to them once, sometimes we need to talk to them 6 times before they're actually going to join the electorate and then show up at the polls, because that's the hard part. Those most recently registered to vote are the least likely to actually show up to the polls. And so not only are we registering folks to vote, but we're providing constant contact after we've registered them to vote to ensure they actually get to the polls. And hopefully they do that how they choose, either by voting by mail, which is still a thing. Although the Commonwealth Court ruled something different this past Friday, we can still vote by mail. And I encourage everyone who's out here who's listening that if you want to vote by mail, continue to request a mail-in ballot, have that application filled out and send you a ballot at your home so you can vote from home if that's how you choose to do so.
One last question before we let you go. The status, you mentioned the Commonwealth Court decision regarding mail-in voting. Has the Supreme Court taken that up yet? How did that decision even come down?
So the Republican Party very upset about what's happening there in terms of the legislation that was passed. Act 77 is the legislation that provided for us to have voting by mail, amongst other things, extended deadlines for voting. It also eliminated straight ticket voting. So initially, Act 77 had bipartisan support passed by both Republicans and Democrats. But then in the 2020 election, you had record numbers of communities of color, young folks, working folks coming out in record numbers and casting their ballot, either by mail or at the location. And this is what, we believe to be the reasoning for trying to do away with vote by mail. It was very successful. It's how so many stayed safe in the midst of a global pandemic, by being able to cast their ballot, by not even leaving their homes, by mailing in their ballot or using a drop box, which was convenient to them. And so it's a shameful in this time that the results of an election have driven some partisans to want to repeal, an act that withdrew barriers from folks who were trying to cast ballots. If you're working 2 and 3 shift jobs, a 13-hour window on a Tuesday in November is just not enough. And so the Commonwealth Court ruled, a 3-2 ruling that they were going to put a stop to the vote by mail. But there was an immediate stay of that decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who will hear that case. And undoubtedly, I'm sure, if they're paying attention to the Pennsylvania Constitution, rule that the Commonwealth Court was incorrect in their decision.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Khadijah, for giving us some of your time today. We really appreciate it. That's Khadijah Kenner. She's the executive director of the New Pennsylvania Project. And can you share your website with folks in case they want to get involved?
Sure. We're all over social media as well. You can find us at the New Pennsylvania Project on most Twitter, on Facebook at New Pennsylvania. You can find us on our website to get all the other information and link you to our social media. You can have an opportunity to donate to our work or get involved. If you want to help us knock on doors and reach people where they are, you can go to www.newpaproject.org. And lots of information there for people. And they can also register to vote. So if you need to register to vote, go to our website and we'll put you through to the portal to register to vote in this very moment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll be back with more of Hall Monitor in a moment.
All right. Well, we would like to thank Khadijah Kenner for being with us. And Denise, thank you for doing that interview.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoyed it because I've been following Khadijah and the New Pennsylvania Project and what they've been doing since its inception. So I'm glad to see that they're getting involved in this particular fight when it comes to redistricting, because it's interesting the fact that you have politicians that actually think that they should be able to pick their bosses, because that's basically what they're doing when they pick which voters they think should have that they should have in their district, as opposed to the opposite way, other way around. They're basically saying, I want to pick my boss, and you shouldn't have the right to do that. I don't have the right to pick my boss.
Right.
That's not how it works. So it shouldn't work that way for people who are in the most important decision-making offices in the country and in the city and in the state.
That's right. Well, we also have Lance with us tonight, who is going to be doing a very interesting report that we had talked about. Well, we talked about it off the show, and I've been really looking forward to this. So, Lance, what are we going to talk about tonight?
Well, we're going to talk about that constitutional amendment. One of the things that we just learned is the courts have ruled that unless there's a constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania, that we can't have absentee voting, which is shocking and I think is wrong. But that's what Commonwealth Court has said, and it's going to be appealed. So you would think that the state legislature, understanding that people need to have absentee ballots, need to be able to have absentee voting, need to be able to have an alternative to a very limited window to vote, would put on the ballot a constitutional amendment so we can have absentee ballots. But you'd be wrong. That's not what's happening. Instead, there's a Republican state representative from the western part of the state who has introduced a bill that would allow for a constitutional amendment, not to make it easier to vote, not to improve the schools and make sure there's equal funding for all the schools, not to focus on public safety or to raise the minimum wage above the $7.25 that it's at in Pennsylvania, the only state in our region that hasn't raised the minimum wage in the last 10 years. But instead, she has a bill that would put on the ballot a constitutional amendment to outlaw the state stores. And this is really kind of fascinating. I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint presentation if I can. So the lawmakers in the past have always said, well, let's look at the state stores and let's come up with an alternative to the state stores. But every time they do that, it turns out the state stores are really good for the Commonwealth. It's really good for the taxpayers. It's really good for the workers. And it offers the consumers lower prices and a better selection. So it's really hard argument to make. We ought to do away with something that's doing better than the private sector. So this state representative, in learning how well change and choice poll, has put up a constitutional amendment that says, should we outlaw the state stores? And while it sounds like that's giving people choice, it really isn't giving people choice, because it doesn't say what will replace them. So we don't know what comes next. And what it also doesn't say is what the state stores give to the people of Pennsylvania. And I think it's worth considering this as we think about the future. There are 594 state stores in Pennsylvania. There's one in every county. Everybody has accessibility. If they're sold off, what we learned in other states, in Iowa and West Virginia and in Washington State, which we'll talk about later, is the number of liquor stores goes up incredibly, 400% or 500%, but it's not dispersed across the state. It's localized. So there'll be parts of Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, which is where the state representative is from, that won't have any stores. And there'll be places like in North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia where there will be many, many more state stores. Now, for those people who want a state store on every block and are somewhat closed-minded to some of the problems that go along with states with liquor stores and long hours and all of that happens, they may think that's a tremendous benefit, and that's their right to think that. But the other things that the state store does is it provides a tremendous amount of money into the Commonwealth, into the revenues, into the general fund. And it does it in three ways. It collects $415 million in tax revenues from the liquor sold. And on top of that, there's $163.9 million that comes in from the state sales tax. Now, those two things would be replaced if the state stores were done away with. Those two funding streams would be replaced by the liquor that's sold in the private sector. But the third figure, $185.1 million, which is clear profit, which goes directly from the state stores into the general revenues, that will not be replaced. So the question becomes, and this is why, again, I believe that instead of having a bill that would talk about what comes after the state stores, the bill only says, should we do away with them? The question becomes, how do we fill the $185 million gap? And there's a hidden gap beyond that, and that is the pension for the state store workers. So every one of the state store workers has a pension. They're good paying jobs, on average about $40,000 a year. The pension, though, is paid for out of the sales for the state store. If we do away with the state store, that becomes a burden of the taxpayers of Pennsylvania, and we're looking at $25 to $30 million a year for the next 30 years to fully fund the pension of the state store workers. So the state store does all of those things, and we don't talk about that in the amendment. All we talk about in the amendment is, do we like the idea of choice? And again, when we look at the highlights, the financial highlights, and I do think that this is probably a little hard to read on people's screens, and hopefully you're watching us on Comcast Channel 6 or Files 29, or listening to us on People Power Radio 106.5. And you can always go to our website, hallmonitor.org, and these will all be posted there in the next day or so you'll be able to look at this. But we see again how much money actually comes from the state store and goes directly into the revenues or supports the state police. So the state police get money. The alcohol and drug addiction programs get money. All of this is funded directly from the state store system. And if the state store system is done away with, we'll have to find another way to pay for that, or we'll have to do away with those programs. So there isn't any other choice. It's really that simple. All the money that comes from the state store profits, that pays the pensions, that pays for the alcohol and drug addiction programs, that pay for the state police, either those programs are eliminated or taxes have to go up to pay for them. There's really no other choice. And we have a fairly good idea what the state store does other than give those revenues, and that is they support this tremendous growing business. One of the things that happens from the state stores, it can say, because we're a state store system, we're going to allocate some of our shelf space for Pennsylvania products, for wineries and distilleries that are in Pennsylvania. And to be clear, no system, no private system would be able to do this. Now, yes, they may say, well, we're going to have some local products, but the state store system guarantees shelf space for local distilleries, and it guarantees shelf space for wineries. And so what we now have is this 162 distillers have been in part funded by the state stores and in part have shelf space through the state stores. And those are 162 distillers in Pennsylvania. Now, I'm not an expert on which of the liquors are world-class and which ones will grow from Philadelphia and grow from Pennsylvania across the nation because their product is so good. But I think an example is something called Blue Coat Gin. Blue Coat Gin is made right here in Philadelphia. It's made in the Fishtown neighborhood. It's won awards. It's now gone national. It's a national product. And as that company continues to grow, it continues to hire people in Pennsylvania from Philadelphia, and those are good paying jobs. Now, no doubt, some of the 162 distilleries aren't going to make it. Not every business that starts is a success, and not every distiller who says they have the best product has the best product. But we know without the state store system, there'd be no incentive for any of these distilleries to open up here in Pennsylvania because it wouldn't guarantee them shelf space. And while it sounds a little strange to me, at least, to think how many wineries we have in Pennsylvania, we have them in part because if you're a winery, if you grow grapes in Pennsylvania, if you make the wine in Pennsylvania, you get automatic shelf space. So those things are, again, an advantage of the state store system that's not being discussed in the amendment and won't come out. So no one's going to talk about, well, where is the next distillery going to be located if it's not in Pennsylvania? Will it go to Delaware? Will it go to West Virginia? Will it go to Alabama? Right now, because the state store system buys for every single one of those stores and can guarantee space in every one of those stores, it's a tremendous incentive for a distillery to open up here in Pennsylvania. And the bill, as I said, doesn't talk about what's going to happen next. The situation is so bad that the prime sponsor of the bill at the hearings in the state capitol declined to answer any questions. So she was asked specifically, what comes next? And she declined to answer. And she was asked if she would testify, and she declined to testify. And I don't think it's a secret why she didn't want to answer any questions, because if you ask questions, all these facts come out, and it becomes really clear that the reason why they don't want to discuss the law, changing the law, is because it's really hard to do, and it's very expensive, and it will harm workers, it'll harm consumers, it'll harm neighborhoods. And if you make it a question of, well, do you want choice or not, then you don't have to look at what the choice is. It's kind of like when President Trump ran on he was going to offer a change from President Obama. Yes, it might have been a change, but does that make it a good change? And we can always say we like choice and we like change, but the more sophisticated you get in analyzing these questions, the more you have to say, well, I'm only in favor of change if the change is good. I'm not in favor of change if it's bad. I'm only in favor of choice if I have a good choice. If the choice is between bad and worse, I don't want that choice. It doesn't make any sense. And why we know all of this is because the state of Washington went through this. Oh, I'm sorry. I have another point I wanted to make before we talk about Washington State. Excuse me. A lot of people think that the liquor prices in Pennsylvania are higher than the liquor prices in New Jersey. Now, I didn't do this study. This was done by the Philadelphia Inquirer, who, by the way, on their editorial page has said we ought to privatize the state stores and sell them off. even though they acknowledge the state store system is really good right now and is getting better, they still believe that we ought to sell them. But so they sent a reporter out to do an evaluation of whether the prices were more in Pennsylvania or more in New Jersey. And I believe that their goal was to show what a mistake it was for the state stores. But I think to their surprise, they found out just the opposite. So when they started looking at the prices, they found that the prices in Pennsylvania, for the most part, are less expensive than the prices in New Jersey. And I see I have a little bit of a problem with my layout here, so I'll go over it. For Jim Beam in the state store, it's $17.99. In New Jersey, it's $2 more. For Seagram's Gin, it's $12.99 in Pennsylvania. It's $15.99 in New Jersey, $3 more. Now, Kahlua is less expensive in New Jersey. It's $44.99 here in Pennsylvania, and it's $39.99 in New Jersey. So that one is less expensive. Coconut rum, $16.99 in Pennsylvania, $18.99 in New Jersey. Captain Morgan rum, $21.99 in Pennsylvania, $24.99. And then a Scotch, which I'm not familiar with, but it seemed like it was very expensive, at least to me. It's $59.99 in the state store, and it's $59.99 in New Jersey. So I'll pause.
I was going to say Macallan Scotch. It's very high end. It's the kind of Scotch that if you order it in a restaurant, it's like they charge you $32 a shot for it. So,
right, not part of my cultural experience. It's not that I'm opposed to it or I think it's wrong. It's just not something I've learned to appreciate. And I think that's to the benefit of my wallet, actually. Now that you mentioned that, I'm glad I don't have a taste for it because it seems to be on the expensive end.
mm-hmm.
But again, you can see all the rhetoric, all of the talk. Turns out it's not true. Yes, some prices are less expensive in New Jersey, but overall the prices in Pennsylvania are less expensive. Now, I do want to mention Delaware is less expensive, but Delaware is less expensive because they don't have any sales tax. So it's not really an equal comparison. But yes, if we were to look at the prices between New Jersey and Delaware, we would find the prices in Delaware are significantly less. If we were to look at the prices between Pennsylvania and Delaware, we'd find that the prices are significantly less. But that's a unique situation. It's also true for cars, washing machines, and televisions. And it's a different type of discussion, what the sales tax is, who pays it, and whether it's a just way of raising revenues. The reason why I'm using this from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it is a few years old. It's the last study that the Inquirer did. It's from September of 2017. But it just clearly shows that everyone who says the prices are a lot less in New Jersey is misleading people. And as we go on, we'll see that we can get a sense of what will happen in Pennsylvania if the state stores are sold by looking what happened in Washington State when it sold its state stores. Now, the reason why Washington is a better match for us to discuss than what happened in Iowa or West Virginia is Washington's a relatively similar state to Pennsylvania. It's got two relatively big cities on opposite ends of the state, Seattle and Spokane, has a fairly large number of rural voters in the middle of the state, although I don't think anyone's ever discussed it as being Alabama in the middle. I think that...
Sorry to interrupt, but it is Alabama in the middle because that's where the Klan is.
Right. But it's a similar match to Pennsylvania. There are parts of Washington that are very densely populated, and there are parts of Washington that have more cattle than they do have people. So when we're looking at comparisons for what happens, we're looking at Washington State to be able to predict what would happen in Pennsylvania if we went ahead. And so this is from a CBS investigation 10 years after the Washington State privatized its system. So these are, again, not my figures. These are not the figures from the unionized workers, not from the union itself. This is what we call the mainstream media investigation of, are we better off? So they looked at three things. They looked at, are the prices better? And they found, as we've talked about, on average, the prices aren't better. Yes, there are some examples where people can hunt for prices and find a lower price. But on average, the prices in Washington State have gone up after it's privatized. The second is the selection. Has the selection gone up? And the answer again is no. The selection in the stores on average has not gone up. Now, what we're going to see next is a breakdown of all the stores that sell it. There is one exception. Total Wine and Liquor has a much larger selection than the State Store had. And again, I don't think that this is such an easy slide to see on your screen, but what it shows is everyone other than Total Wine has a much smaller selection than what existed in the State Store system. And just to give you an idea, the Pennsylvania State Store system on the small store has 2,500 items. On the specialty stores, they have over 4,000 items, and you can do online ordering for whatever you want. So we know that there will be some stores. If you're fortunate enough to live next to a Total Wine store, you'll have a better selection than what you have now. But for the overwhelming majority of the state of Washington, they lost selection, and they lost it fairly significantly. And if you look at this list, you'll see that there's no real small independent stores on it. The independent stores weren't allowed to get licenses. They had to be at least 10,000 square foot to get a license. And again, in Washington State, it was a very similar attempt, in this case successful, in a two-step process. First, they said, should we outlaw the state stores? And once they voted to outlaw the state store, then they wrote the bill as to what would take its place. So no one who voted to do away with the state store knew that there weren't going to be any small liquor stores. And the few small liquor stores that were grandfathered in, so the existing liquor stores in Washington State were sold to entrepreneurs, they can't compete because, of course, they can't compete with Walmart and Target and all of the multinational corporations that have bigger buying power. The reason why Pennsylvania has lower prices than the independent stores in New Jersey is because of Pennsylvania's incredible buying power. We see again in Washington, clearly, selection goes down for the overwhelming majority of people. And then the next question is, the people who advance to say, well, we'll sell more liquor, and maybe that's a good thing and maybe it's not. So therefore, you don't have to worry about the tax revenues. But it turns out that's not true in Washington State. The tax revenues fell off even as Washington State raised their prices. So in Pennsylvania, even if we raise the price of alcohol, which is going to happen if it's privatized, it still will not collect as much taxes as what the state store collects and the profit from the state store. And that's, again, not even talking about the legacy pension. So we can see a chart of how bad it is. So here's the chart that shows when they sold off the state store and what's happened to the state's revenue. Now, Washington State did an interesting thing to try and make up for this lost revenue. They legalized marijuana sales for recreational use. Maybe Pennsylvania will do that as well. I'm not sure whether that's going to pass here or not. But the only way that Washington State could equalize their revenue stream was by legalizing marijuana and taxing that. And that made the revenues equal to where they were when they had the state store system. It's an interesting solution, but it doesn't change the fact that when they sold off the state stores, the state revenues went down. So again, prices went up, selection went down, and tax revenues went down. And the question is, are we better off? The reporter for CBS News in Washington State asked the question, are we better off? And they came up with the answer of no, they're not better off now that the state store system is sold. The tax revenues are lower, there's less selection. The only thing, again, that they could point to that could be considered a success is the availability. It was much easier in Washington State to buy alcohol, to buy spirits now than it was before when the state store system was in place. And again, if your primary interest is not the price, is not the selection, and is not in what the revenues are for the state, your primary interest is making sure that you can pick up what you want while you're getting your kids' diapers, well, this would be a good thing for you. But if you're interested in price, selection, and the well-being of the state, then the answer to the question is, was Washington State better off after 10 years? The answer is no. They weren't. So how is it that Pennsylvania is able to use the state store system to the advantage of the taxpayers of Pennsylvania? And this comes out of the Pennsylvania Liquor Board Controls webpage. And this is how they talk about using their buying power. So the easiest example I found to explain is what they do with wine. And again, I'm not the best judge of wine. It's not that I'm opposed to drinking it. It's that I am not an expert on what wines are considered premier wines.
That would be me.
But okay. Well, then maybe you can talk to how successful the chairman's selections are. What the Pennsylvania system has set up. Go ahead.
Actually, what the chairman's selection has done for me personally has allowed me to try new wines that I probably wouldn't have been able to discover anywhere else. For example, Black Girl Magic wines. And I mean, they're around, but they're not around as much as some other kinds of wine. I've also gotten to try different kinds of Cabernet Sauvignon, which I use for cooking, and also, good white wines and different things. It gives you one thing I will hand to state stores when it comes to their wine selection. There is literally something for everyone. And even the stuff that's like $9.99 is still really good.
Right. They have a program where they go out and they buy in batches, and they require the supplier to sell the wine to the state store at 1/3 off what it sells for anyplace else. So again, because they're buying for almost 600 stores, and they're buying for all of Pennsylvania, in the same way that Walmart uses its collective buying power to bring down prices, the Pennsylvania state store system uses that collective buying power to bring down prices. The difference is, where does the profits go? The Walmart profits go to the Walmart family and their stockholders. The profits for Pennsylvania go into the revenues. And you can see from Denise and from other people who follow wine and spirits that the chairman's selections and making sure that there's shelf space for Pennsylvania stores creates a tremendous opportunity for people to try different things, for businesses to grow. And hopefully one of the things that we will look towards the future, if the amendment is turned down, is asking the state system to start making sure that some of the distilleries are owned by women, owned by people of color, that some of the wineries are owned by women and people of color. And that's a relatively easy thing to do for a state store system, to say, not only are we going to make sure that we have shelf space for Pennsylvania corporations, we're going to make sure we have shelf space for women-owned companies and minority-owned companies. And if we sell the state store system, we will not be able to do that. And again, we hear from people who say, well, retailers could do that. And that's absolutely true. If you go into a supermarket, there may be a section of the supermarket that says local produce. The difference is it's required in the state store system, and it will not be required if the state stores are sold off. So I made a partial list of all the distilleries in Pennsylvania. Now, these are all growing businesses. There are two on this list that I did a little research on. One is Bluebird Distilling, and the other is Philadelphia Distilling. I guess Denise knows, but it was a surprise to me that people go to tastings and they get numbers and rated, like the Olympics of spirit making. And these two companies do very well in national competition and look like they will be growing into national corporations. No guarantee, but that's what our state store system allows to happen. As I said, there are 162 of these distilleries throughout the state, and the state store system actually says you should go on a distillery tour. They do remind you to have a driver who's not drinking, but it's kind of an interesting concept. Go from place they make whiskey to place they make whiskey to place they make whiskey.
I'm always a driver in those situations, and I have been many times.
So if we could close down the slideshow, and then I'll finish up. So at the hearing, there were a couple interesting things that I thought. One is there was no consumer organization, no organization of regular people who said, we want this. The only people who said they wanted it was the Chamber of Commerce and the people who make the wines and spirits. They complained bitterly that the state store system was not paying them what they hoped to get. That the state store system, as they called it, was using its monopoly power to lower the price for what they were putting on the shelves. And they didn't think that they wanted to charge more, and they didn't think it was fair that the state was able to do it. Somehow they didn't complain about Walmart doing it to them, but they did complain about the state doing it to them. So we don't see anyone who was actually a regular person or represented regular people saying that this is the system that we want. And as I said to begin, it's not a surprise to me. You know, we have all these very, very significant issues in our state. Our education system, our public safety, voting, raising the minimum wage. It's been at $7.25 for the last 12 years. What do we do about fracking? Excuse me. We have all these very significant issues. State legislature won't allow any of those to be put on the ballot. The only thing they want to be put on the ballot is a constitutional amendment to end the state stores. Now, there are legitimate reasons for people to vote for it. If the most important thing to you is to do away with the state involvement in anything, of course you should vote for it. If the most important thing for you is to do away with the union that represents the state store workers, of course you should vote for it. Or if the most important thing to you is to have a liquor store in every corner neighborhood, in every street in Pennsylvania, of course you should vote for it. But be aware, the Constitution doesn't tell you what's going to replace it. It's more than likely what we saw in Washington. More than likely, the licenses will go to the big box stores, selection will go down, prices will go up, tax revenues will fall off. Again, we can solve that by legalizing marijuana. But the idea of having the nice corner neighborhood store that offers you a selection of wine, that's much like the movie lines that come out of Mr. So-and-so Goes to Washington. It simply didn't exist when Washington did it, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that will happen here. And if the people who are supporting this are honest, what they will say is, we'll replace the state store system, because the choice isn't choice or no choice. The choice is this or that. And they won't tell us what the that is. And that's my report. I'm hoping that over time, more and more people will understand that there is a way to improve the state store system without selling it. Act 39, which allowed the wine and beer to be sold in supermarkets, set up a commission that was supposed to meet 4 times a year to talk about improvements. The Republican leadership in the State House has not appointed its members, and as a result, it hasn't met. Now, the reason why I believe they haven't appointed their members, if you had members and the commission met, they'd come up with ideas, and there would be continual improvement. There's no question, everything can be improved, and we should strive for that. But this way, instead of improving it, they can complain about it, and then they can say, well, we have to do it away with it. It's not in the consumer's interest, it's not in the taxpayer's interest, and it's probably not in the public interest, but it certainly is in the interest of the big boxes and the big corporations and the people who think ideologically rather than practically.
What I'd be interested in knowing, Larry, particularly about Washington, and I think I may just look that up tonight when we get off the air. I'd like to know how crime has been impacted by Washington State getting rid of its state stores, because I'm thinking that in Pennsylvania, if Pennsylvania did that, all the little places in the Alabama section of Pennsylvania is not where the bulk of the new liquor stores would go. The bulk of the new liquor stores would go to southeastern Pennsylvania, where the last thing you need is someone drunk, angry, and handling a gun.
Right. So they've done some study about binge drinking, but it's very difficult to get to real answers with this because of the legalization of marijuana. So it appears that binge drinking has declined. What they're seeing is fewer sales of beer and fewer sales of wine and more sales of spirits and marijuana. The same thing's true about public safety. Washington State has gone through some very difficult times with their public safety, with their policing. And the information that we're getting out of the state makes it very difficult to make those comparisons. So you would have to ask the question, what was the effect of the Black Lives demonstrations? What was the effect of the response to the Black Lives demonstrations? What is the effect of COVID and all of those issues? The academic studies all suggest what you're saying, but the practical studies out of Washington State, the data isn't there to come to answer your question because of all the other intervening variables. They don't hold anything constant. Everything is in change. And as such, yes, reported crime has gone up, but whether that correlates to the state stores or something else, nobody knows. Your point is right about where the stores open. Washington State has a number of counties, and again, there are very few people living in these counties where there are no liquor stores anymore. And that's what happens. You're right. That's what history has shown, that the people get the licenses will move to heavily populated areas. And the other thing I think is going to happen in Pennsylvania is they're going to not have liquor licenses for small stores. They're only going to do big box stores. And the question is, will the dollar stores start to be there to get licenses to sell alcohol? In some states, you can go into the gas station and buy it. In other states, it's only in big supermarkets. And other states have a number of smaller stores that sell it and don't allow it to be sold in supermarkets. The problem is we don't know what comes after. If we decide to sell the state stores,
I think we may have lost Lance there right at the end. We have you back, Lance. What was that last thing you said there?
So the problem in answering these type of questions is we don't know what will replace the state stores. And that's the way the Republican leadership wants it, because as soon as you start answering that, excuse me, it becomes evident why we don't want it. So what they want is what they did in Washington. First say, don't you want choice? And then after people say, oh yeah, I want choice, then say, well, here's the choice you got.
Yeah.
But you don't have any choice about that.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they're going to offer liquor licenses to small stores. I don't think they're going to offer it to African-American entrepreneurs or women entrepreneurs. That's not what they did in Washington State. In Washington State, the only small stores were the legacy state stores. Everything else went to big boxes, 10,000 square foot or more. Opens the door for the dollar store to become a liquor store.
Yeah.
Again, whether you think that's a good thing or not, it's up to you. But I just think people ought to know what the facts are.
Right. Well, Lance, thank you so much for doing that. And it seems to me, whenever we talk about privatizing anything, this is what happens, right? Less choice, prices go up, less tax revenue. It's the same story every single time. And that's how people want it, or at least that's how some people want it.
Yes. And the goal from my point of view is to get the people who are supporting this to tell us what comes next. Just be honest with us. Yeah. We all want improvement. What's your definition of improvement? Because your definition of improvement might not be the same as mine.
Right.
I don't necessarily think you're welcome.
So the last thing we're going to talk about here, Denise, something very interesting happened last week. Mm-hmm. The city council, the district attorney's office, the police department all collaborated on a report about gun violence in Philadelphia. And the report, if I had it clocked at 88 pages, Denise. Is that what you had as well?
Yeah. And it was, you ever see a paper where someone basically just repeats themselves over several paragraphs to make it longer? That's kind of how it felt.
Yeah.
And what was sad about it was a lot of the people who needed to be a part of that report weren't in it.
Right. It was one of those things that, just on that point, repeated throughout the report was the idea that all agencies who were involved in this need to reach out to people in the community, people who have been victims of violence. Where was that in the report? You know, the report itself did not do that. And before we got on the air tonight, we were talking about how a constant refrain in this report was the need for better schools. But the school district wasn't in this report. They didn't participate. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say they weren't even really at the press conference.
No. And one of the things that struck me is you have this entire 88-page report, and different city agencies contributed to it, and their contributions were segmented throughout the report. So this is the police department. This is what they think. This is what the district attorney's office thinks. This is what the health department thinks. And you had all of these different agencies contributing to this report, which is the 100 Shooter Report, which you can find on the City Council webpage. So you had all these different agencies contributing to the report, and the cognitive dissonance that you would see. One agency would say one thing, and then you'd have another agency contradicting that. Was very surprising to me, but maybe it shouldn't have been, because that seems to be what's been happening throughout the entire for the last few years. You know, you have different offices not really communicating with one another, doing different things, maybe contradictory things, maybe duplicating effort, but you really don't have a concerted plan. And coming out of this report, I didn't see a concerted plan. I don't know if you did, Denise.
No, and I think that's been the problem that everyone has had with the city's response to gun violence, time and infinitum. You hear a lot about a plan coming. You get a lot of reports. Everybody has done a lot of reading, but none of that reading sounds like a plan or seems like a plan or manifests itself as a plan. And while I can appreciate the fact that they took a look at these shootings from the last half of 2020 and they try to do something, that makes sense with them, to try to explain them and stuff. While I appreciate that, while I'm sure many Philadelphians appreciate that, the bottom line is what they want to know is what you're going to do to make it so we're not doing these reports every single year until the end of time. And so far, no one has come up with a plan for that.
No, and I was hoping that one of the things we would see at the end were next steps, or even here's some legislative items we're going to look at. But there wasn't any of that. Right. And I felt like a lot of this information were things that we've discussed before. There really wasn't a lot of new information here. And that to me was also kind of disappointing.
Yeah. I mean, new information, next steps, just anything, because there's a certain desperation that people are starting to feel about gun violence in the city. We had nearly 550 people murdered last year. And folks are looking at this year and they're like, it doesn't look like it's getting better. And after a while, perception becomes reality. And if you don't deal with that, then things get really out of control.
Well, that's right. And I think that's all the time we have for this week. We will be back next week. You can find our newsletter and you can see us on our website, hallmonitor.org. You can visit us on Facebook, on Twitter, and subscribe to our newsletter via our Facebook page or our website. So we will see you next week.